In 2022, the water levels in Lake Powell dropped so low, experts worried the Colorado River wouldn't be able to flow past Glen Canyon Dam. This situation is called deadpool, and it's one of many concerns surrounding a drier and hotter Colorado River. All forecasting points to another dry year for the basin. This is expected to continue over the long term as climate change impacts the West. If you've been following the news around the Colorado River, you might know that we've come to a serious decision point. The river is getting drier while our use has only grown over time. The current guidelines that manage the water in the river expire in 2026, leaving the door open to create new guidelines that better manage the river and its drinking water supply into the future. We talked a little about what the future for the river could look like with Kevin Fedarko back in January. So, how are things going now? WRA is engaged in the process to create real solutions that consider the health of the river and the long-term sustainability of our communities. Right now, the 7 Colorado River Basin states are talking about these guidelines, but they haven't made much progress. I had a conversation with one of WRA's experts on the Colorado River, John Berggren. John has been deeply involved in the work to create the new guidelines. He answered some of my questions about the state of our snowpack in the West, where the negotiations on the river are going, and what we need to see in the future to sustain a healthy Colorado River. On this 2 Degrees Out West mini-pod, how are the Colorado River negotiations going?
Yeah, my name is John Berggren, and I'm a regional policy manager for Western Resource Advocates, and I help lead our Colorado River work. My background is in Colorado River policy. I went to grad school for environmental studies and studied the Colorado River for many years, and then have been lucky enough to work with WRA for the last 7 years, and really spending a lot of time on the Colorado River.
First, I wanted to learn about the snowpack in the Colorado River Basin. How much water do we actually have this year?
So to answer that, you kind of have to put this year in context, which is basically we have an over-appropriated river since it was originally divvied up just over 100 years ago, and then we have pretty significant water supply and demand imbalances for about the last 20-25 years. And what that actually means is just your demand on the river is more than the supply, and how you see that play out is the drawdown of the 2 biggest reservoirs on the Colorado River, Lake Mead and Lake Powell. They're actually when full, the 2 largest reservoirs in the country, and they're both sitting at about a third full right now. And that's, again, as a result of climate change, drought, and overuse and demands that are greater than supply. And so with that context, this year's snowpack started off to a decent start. We were actually, for a lot of the year, especially in the upper basin, the higher parts of the basin, looking at about average snowpack, which is good, and we were happy about that. But since the last couple month or so, as the snow started to melt and started to run off, we've actually seen a decline in what is making it into the river. And so right now, the projections, we use these federal agencies to look at stream flow forecasts, and the projections went from average snowpack, but maybe 70% of average inflow into Lake Powell to 65% of average. When you're already facing the long-term systemic challenges that I just mentioned, and your reservoirs are only a third full, you don't want a year where your runoff is actually looking pretty poor, and just over half of average is now expected to reach Lake Powell later this summer.
None of that is good news for the Colorado River or the 35 million people that depend on it. When you consider the long-term trends of a West that's getting hotter and drier due to the impacts of climate change, some serious concerns arise. John explained how climate change is impacting the Colorado River over the long term.
This type of year where we saw maybe close to average snowpack, but we're seeing much lower than average runoff is kind of a good example of the impacts of climate change here in the West. For a variety of reasons, average snowpacks are not translating into average runoffs anymore. And so we can expect more years like this. And what that means in practice is no longer is it sufficient to get an average year snowpack to really help our rivers and build storage in the reservoirs. You need a above average snowpack to get decent flows into the river and into the reservoirs. And so it just highlights this is a challenge that we're facing now. And as things continue to warm, as expected, we're going to further face these challenges, and they may get worse as things heat up. And you see all the impacts from climate change on things like runoff efficiency to snow sublimation to groundwater, to soil moisture impacts, and just a lot of the things we're seeing as a result of climate change.
All of these terms, like runoff efficiency, sublimation, and low soil moisture, basically mean one thing: less snowmelt makes it into the river. John explained how that works.
So a variety of things. It's we're seeing the runoff when the snow actually starts to melt is happening a few weeks earlier than historically it would, and that is again due to warming temperatures. And when your snow melt happens earlier, the vegetation starts growing earlier, and with that comes demand. Basically, it's called evapotranspiration, but it's demand from the snow melt and the water that is melting off it. And if the earlier you do that, the more plants have a chance to grow. They evapotranspirate that water, and that is lost to the system. It no longer flows off into the river. So that's one way it's impacted. The other challenge is soil moisture, and what we've seen in recent years is our soil is getting drier, and what that means is when you do have that runoff from the snowpack melting, that soil actually kind of acts like a sponge, and it soaks it up, and it doesn't, and again, so it doesn't run off into the rivers. It actually gets soaked up by the soils. And so if you have earlier snowmelt, you have less efficient snowmelts, and you have pretty dry soils. All that translates to is, again, an average snowpack not becoming an average runoff, but much below average runoff.
It's a dry year in the West, but as we mentioned, this is a significant year on the river for other reasons as well. John explained how the negotiations to govern the river's water supply play into all of this.
So there's a multi-year negotiation underway to replace a set of guidelines for how the two main reservoirs, Lake Powell and Lake Mead, are operated. Those guidelines were originally put in place in 2007, and they were interim, so they were a 19-year deal, and they expire at the end of this year. And new guidelines need to be in place by the time we plan the following year's operation. So the new guidelines need to be in place August of 2026, roughly. And so there's a federal NEPA process underway to develop those new guidelines.
The NEPA review John is referencing is a review process mandated by the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. It requires federal agencies like the Bureau of Reclamation to consider the environmental impacts of regulatory decisions they make. In this case, the impacts of various proposed management plans for the Colorado River. NEPA review is important because it helps make sure that the health of the environment is considered by federal agencies as they use their regulatory authority.
And the Bureau of Reclamation is leading that. So that process basically is currently evaluating a set of alternatives or different operating regimes for the river. And their goal is to produce a draft environmental impact statement later this summer or early fall.
A quick note that since the time of recording, that draft EIS date has been pushed back to more around December 2025.
And then also the 7 U.S. basin states are also negotiating their proposal, their idea for a new set of guidelines. And so those negotiations are underway as well. So like I said, new guidelines need to be in place by late summer 2026. And so just working backwards from there of what needs to be done between a final record of decision, a final environmental impact statement, all sorts of side agreements, draft environmental impact statement, public comment, all that. There's a tight time frame, but it's moving for now. We hope those conversations stay productive and we're able to get to a comprehensive set of guidelines by next year.
The good news is there's a way forward. WRA and our partners have a series of solutions that we want to see implemented in the new guidelines. These solutions consider the health of the river and the long-term sustainability of the system.
So, we we think there's a variety of things that you could add to a preferred alternative, which basically just means the alternative that the Bureau of Reclamation has selected for the new guidelines. Ways to incorporate environmental values into those new guidelines. So things like being proactive with your reservoir management, considering actual hydrology, what's flowing in the river, as a way to help determine those reservoir operations, finding ways to be responsive to climate change and not just looking at reservoir elevation levels as your indicator for operations, but actually responding to changing hydrologies as that continues. Finding ways to embed environmental stewardship into all aspects of the guidelines, from how you determine operations to benefit the Grand Canyon and its ecosystem, how you operate the system to benefit flows in the upper basin, in the main stem Colorado and some of the bigger tributaries, all the way down to the Colorado River Delta in Mexico, and how to incorporate considerations of the environmental impacts down there. With everything I've talked about with climate change, there's so much uncertainty with what's going to happen in the future with this river. We have to be flexible in responding to changing conditions. And so what we would like to see is a robust set of flexible tools or policies or programs that can respond to these conditions that are ever changing and sometimes unexpected. And so if we can develop ways to incentivize conservation and then also take advantage of that conserved water to help benefit environmental flows and protect infrastructure and respond to these changing conditions. Any of those flexible, innovative tools are things that we would love to see in the new guidelines.
The trouble is, there's not a lot of time left to figure out these guidelines. John says the time is now, and the states need to come together on an agreement as soon as they can. He explained what that tight timeline looks like.
So it's continued negotiations between the 7 basin states. Negotiations between the U.S. and Mexico will also happen over that time. And then also the Bureau of Reclamation moving forward with the NEPA process. And so over the next, they're spending this summer analyzing the set of alternatives that they announced late last year. And then they'll produce a draft environmental impact statement, which basically evaluates and models the impacts of those various alternatives on environmental resources throughout the basin. There'll be a public comment period after that draft is released, and then they'll develop a final environmental impact statement, which will include the preferred alternative, which is basically what they're moving forward with in terms of new guidelines. Shortly after that, they develop a record of decision, which is basically the final policy, and that goes into place. And then, like I said, there's a variety of side agreements. There's some legislation that needs to happen in certain boards and other elected offices throughout the basin also need to sign off on it. So there's a lot going on, and it's definitely a time crunch, but we hope it's doable in a way that does consider what I talked about earlier, what WRA wants to see, which is really a robust consideration of environmental values and how to incorporate environmental values into these new sets of guidelines.
The decisions made in the coming months will be critical for the future of the Colorado River and the 35 million people that depend on it. If you would like more detail on what ideas we have to better manage the river, you can check out the links in our show notes. If you'd like to hear that previous podcast with Kevin Fedarko, I'll also put that in the show notes. Are you inspired or curious about our work? WRA is supported by individuals like you. We work on the state level to see action and policy that protects the land, water, and air of the West. To help us continue with this work, visit the link in our show notes. Lastly, WRA would like to thank our sponsors who help make our work possible. Our champion sponsor is First Bank. Our signature sponsors are Denver Water, Torch Clean Energy, Scarpa, GoCo, and Southwest Energy Efficiency Project. Our supporting partners are GoCo, BSW Wealth Partners, Meridian Public Affairs, Group 14 Engineering, and Kind Design. Thank you for listening.